In the last week of April 1945, spring in Bavaria was trying to drive away the traces of winter, yet the weather hovered like a hesitant passerby, now warm, now cold. The snow along the ridgelines had dwindled to a thin pale line, but the soil in the lowlands was still wet and sticky, exuding the smell of earth that had gone a long time without being turned. The pine woods lining the road stood sparse, their branches scraping against each other in the cold wind and making a dry, whispering sound. Following the road east through this region, a small town crouched quietly in the shadows. In the past few months, its residents had grown used to silence, spending most of their time behind doors or peeking through narrow gaps in the curtains to observe what was happening outside. Many houses had been requisitioned and then hastily vacated, leaving behind exposed beams, scattered tools, and dust no one bothered to sweep. In the barns, empty feed troughs still held last night's dew, and some livestock sheds, emptied by force, were never used again. In a more hidden area, stretching inward from the forest's edge, lay a vast complex of buildings surrounded by iron fencing. People only knew it had to do with labor and factory work, and that since 1942, this belt of land had been requisitioned piece by piece for all kinds of physical and delicate tasks. Those brought here were always young, silent, and mostly from regions ravaged by the war. Once their figures passed through the gate and into the wire, almost no one ever saw them come back out. As the course of the war shifted in the spring of 1945, the movements within this area grew more hurried. At night, one could often hear axles grinding over gravel, the beams of headlights sweeping across the maples and pines, as if some secret transport was being carried out again and again. Before dawn, the traces of those vehicles would be hastily covered over, leaving only scraps of half-charred paper scattered by the wind, blackened along the edges like pages of history, torn to pieces by a giant, unseen hand. By late April, this uneasy atmosphere had become even more pronounced. Dull explosions rumbled in the distance, like iron blocks rolling in a valley. With the front line drawing near, everyone felt a peculiar tension that was neither simple fear nor clear hope, but something more like a suspense that had nowhere to settle. Villagers maintained a cautious quiet. It was as if this region itself was waiting to be overwritten. It was in this heavy stillness that one morning, a convoy of American vehicles rolled into the area. The trucks moved slowly along the road, tires carving muddy tracks into the wet ground. In the back of one of the vehicles, Medic James Harrow caught a whiff of the air and frowned slightly. It wasn't the metallic tang of blood he knew from the battlefield, nor the sharp bite of gunpowder, but a smell of rot and damp from within a closed space. Something more than mere filth, more like layers of things long pressed into the dark, forced on this day to be exposed. As a medic, James was more sensitive to smells than most soldiers, and what he was sensing now made his hand tighten unconsciously on the strap of his aid bag. He climbed down with the others, his boots landing on the wet mud with a soft, heavy thud. The woods around them were unnaturally still, so still that even birds seemed reluctant to stop there. Farther off, along the tracks, lay old crates and planks, scattered and broken, with scorch marks still fresh on their surfaces, evidence that someone had recently tried, in haste, to dispose of something, and had not had time to finish. He knew he was about to face a special kind of place, but even so, he still underestimated just how dense reality would feel. Following the unit toward their designated objective, he found the air growing thicker and more oppressive. The closer they came to the wire, harsh wheel ruts and splintered wood on the ground showed that a large-scale transport had passed through in the past few days. In some spots, piles of ash had not yet cooled, giving off a flinty, scorched smell. Inside the wire, the buildings stood in mostly neat rows, but each carried a visible sense of haste. Doors stood flung wide, windows half open, and floors littered with paper scraps, cloth strips, and black wood dust. James went in with the other medics to the first row of barracks. Inside, frail shapes moved in the darkness, so thin it was hard to guess their age, many of them too weak to stand. James threw himself into the work at once. His hands, trained by countless repetitions on the battlefield, moved quickly and surely, but his pulse was gradually rising. This was not a battlefield. It was something formed by confinement over years, another kind of desolation. He was cleaning a wound on the arm of a man who looked to be in his 50s when he heard a low shout from outside, as if someone were calling for help in a restrained voice. A scout ran up to the medical area's doorway, face taut. He spoke quickly, the words tumbling out, yet still uneven. "On the south side, that old stable, we heard chains." James froze for a moment. Chains. In his professional experience, a deeply ominous word. The scout's breathing was ragged. It was clear the unease came not from running, but from fear. He added, "Very faint." like someone's moving, but can't really move. James grabbed his aid bag at once and told the scout to lead the way. He didn't know exactly what kind of facility it was, but he had a strong sense it could not be an ordinary barracks. Old stables were usually used for horses or equipment, and in emergencies they might be turned to other, less visible purposes. The road narrowed as they went, mud mixed with gravel underfoot, the marks of vehicles that had driven through in haste. The air was colder, wetter, heavier than in the main compound. Even before they reached the stable, James could feel an indescribable pressure, as if a slab of invisible stone were weighing down the air. They stopped in front of a wooden structure that looked ordinary at first glance. Its iron door, however, had been welded shut, the seams bright and recent. The gap between the door and the frame was so thin one could barely see inside. James stepped closer and listened. He heard it. Clink, clink. The sound was extremely faint, yet distinct, iron being unevenly dragged, as if someone was trying to move a chain with too little strength to do more than make it rustle. He took a deep breath. Blow the door! The engineers came quickly and set a charge by the entrance. The countdown echoed slowly in the air, each second drawn out. After the explosion, dust and splinters flew outward, and James was the first to rush into the stable light, slipped in through cracks in the broken wooden walls, thin and cold. The air was heavy, like a cellar that had been shut for years, filled with the smell of damp straw and something indefinably rotten. The sight before him made him stop dead. Between the wooden posts, along the walls, beneath the beams, chains hung everywhere, and at the ends of those chains were 14 children. Their bodies were thin as sketch lines, all angles and hollows. Skin was stretched tight over bone, eye sockets sunken deep. Iron cuffs had pressed their ankles so hard the flesh had gone purple. In some places, the skin had broken down into ulcers. The children crouched, drooped, or leaned against the posts, too weak to lift their heads. They turned their eyes toward the light, yet showed no reaction. James needed only a second to understand. This was not the result of a day or two in chains. It was a confinement long enough to alter their bodies and their reflexes. The soldiers started cutting the chains. Each child's body reacted differently. Some collapsed immediately, limbs buckling as soon as the metal fell away. Some instinctively raised their arms to shield their heads. From a few, there came a faint whimper, as if they were still trapped in a nightmare. One child's leg spasmed after a brief attempt to stand, and he dropped to his knees. James stepped in to help him up, and the boy recoiled as though burned, arms flying up to guard his skull. The movement was too practiced, too deeply ingrained. He wasn't refusing rescue. He was dodging the punishment his body had long been taught to anticipate. When the 11th child was freed, a teenage boy suddenly lifted his head. In his eyes, there was a terror beyond fear of strangers, a reflexive horror toward something lodged deep in memory. His voice came out like torn breaths forced through a narrow space. "He'll come back." Then his whole body sagged again. James said nothing, neither did the others. They understood that whoever he was, he stood for something that had scarred these children very deeply. As the children were carried to a temporary medical tent, the line of stretcher-bearers moved in utter silence. The tent was warmer inside, but even when the boys were laid out on blankets, their bodies remained tightly curled, like small animals in their shells. Any rapid movement nearby triggered instant flinching and defensive gestures. James spent almost the entire day weaving among them, tending to the most basic needs. Their sensitivity to touch was extreme. He had to keep every finger's pressure feather light. When he gently cleaned one boy's wound, the boy stayed tense at first, but there was finally a barely perceptible softening in his eyes. James realized that at least some of them had begun to sense he was different from those who had once held the power to decide their fate. That night, the wind brushed against the canvas and made it lightly tremble. The sound alone caused several children to curl up at once. Reacting as if to some terrifying signal, James slowed his steps, avoiding sudden noises. The air in the tent was heavy and dim. While he was cooling the forehead of a small boy burning with fever, the child's fingers closed around his sleeve without the boy even waking. It was an unconscious plea, with no words, no sobbing, just that fragile grip on a scrap of cloth to maintain a tenuous connection with the world. James remained seated for a long time, until the child's breathing gradually steadied. A few days later, the boys began, in broken phrases, to reveal fragments of their story. They came from different satellite labor sites, chosen, moved, and moved again, until they were brought to a special work detail. There they had to handle extremely small metal components, not knowing their purpose, and were forbidden to ask. Every word spoken, every hesitation, could draw punishment. They were afraid to even mention the man in black gloves, referring to him only as him. This him controlled whether they stayed or vanished. He would appear without warning in the workshop, inspecting them one by one with an icy, measuring gaze. The more they came to know, the lower their chances of survival became. While sorting through discarded papers in a trash heap, James found a charred fragment of a file. The The broken lines of text contained a phrase, 14 juvenile males, special handling, only under H's directive. Reading that made a dull ache bloom in his chest. He understood that at this level of secrecy, the children's very existence was considered something to be covered up. Several more days passed. One night, the youngest boy, Makik, woke from sleep with a sudden jolt, his body folding in on itself as though trying to shield certain often hurt places. James did not reach out. He simply sat down beside him, letting his presence act as an anchor to hold the child in the present. Only after several minutes did Makik's eyes slowly open. In that extremely fragile moment, his voice emerged, almost inaudible. "Don't send us back." It was the first time any of the children had actively voiced their fear. That one sentence pinned James in place. He realized that their trust in him did not come from his uniform or his role, but from the fact that over these few days he had never tried to control, command, or intimidate them. He had only maintained a steady, predictable presence, something they had never known. Eventually, after many attempts, Machik managed to bring out the words, buried deepest inside him, they were not workers. The so-called precision assembly task had never actually succeeded. The man in charge, fearful of being held responsible for failure, shifted the blame onto the children, saying it was their unsteady hands that had ruined things they were locked into that stable so that, as the front moved closer, they could be quietly disposed of, so that it would all appear as if it had never happened. Listening to those fragmented sentences, James felt as though a heavy stone were being pressed inch by inch into his chest. He didn't even have the strength left to rage. All he could do was remain steady, making sure his own emotions didn't frighten the boys again. A few days later, new orders arrived. James was to be sent forward to support the front line. When he walked into the medical tent, 14 pairs of eyes turned toward him at the same time. The look in them was neither expectation nor ordinary pleading, but rather the gaze of children who had been abandoned over and over, and yet still longed, one last time, to be certain of something. They were afraid of what they might hear, yet needed an answer more than anything. The oldest, Andrzej, raised his head slightly. His lips were stiff, his voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the air. "Will you come back?" It was the first and only time in this entire story that they put their hope into someone else's hands by their own initiative. James knew this was a moment in which he could not lie. He walked up to them slowly, his heart feeling as if it were being clamped tight. He spoke only 3 words, "I will come." From the corner, Maciek's weak voice followed, "You won't lie?" James looked at him and answered quietly, "I won't." The children's shoulders finally, gradually dropped. Some cried silently, some curled deeper into their blankets, but for the first time they all exhaled together. That night all 14 boys slept peacefully under the same piece of canvas. The wind was still cold and the world was still at war, but within this ruin there now existed a space where they could fall asleep without fear. James stood at the tent's entrance, listening to their faint yet steady breathing. He knew he might not return, and he had no way of knowing what the future held for them. But in that moment, one thing was absolutely clear in his mind. 14 lives were still in this world, because he had refused to look away, and that was the most important thing he could possibly have done on that patch of land. In the many years that followed that night, James would sometimes find himself back in that dim, cramped stable in his dreams. Wood dust, chains, light and wind magnified in his memory. He never tried to explain the meaning of that night to others. In war, everything is chaotic, broken, flung in pieces across time. Yet the faces of those children remained for him the one intact shape amid all his scars and exhaustion. Only later did he understand that saving them had not been a duty the war assigned to him, but something the war had tried, and failed, to strip away, the freedom to remain human. Those 14 children did not survive because of the outcome of the front line, but because in that place built to bury evidence, someone refused to let them become an untraceable footnote. Their existence itself was a quiet resistance against being erased. History does not always remember their names. The files did not even record their exact numbers. The world will likely never know what their days in the dark were truly like. Yet it is precisely these almost unknown, small lives that make up the most truthful part of war. Not the flags, not the commands, not the victories and defeats, but those breaths that almost vanished, almost were discarded, and yet stubbornly persisted. Looking back years later, James always felt that what he saved that day was not just 14 children, but a missing page of history itself. For as long as someone remains alive, those burned fragments, torn off records, and buried secrets still have a chance to be seen, and that was all he had ever tried to hold on to amid those ruins.